I started out my academic career as an art historian with a major in Asian languages, and that took me to Asia and sort of disillusioned me with traditional spiritual approaches in the Asian style. And I reconnected then with my childhood love of nature and pretty much abandoned the humanities and went into the sciences. But by then it was too late to become a real scientist, and I was too tainted by my time again among the poets and the artists. So I had to become a very soft, hard scientist. So I got a degree in conservation of natural resources, about as soft a science as you'll ever hope to touch. And I did a lot of traveling around looking for a viable, vibrant, numinous approach to spiritual reality. And the only place I found it was in the Amazon basin, where, as you know, there are extremely archaic groups of people who never submitted themselves to the historical process the way the peoples of the Middle East and Europe did. And there flourishes, through the use of chemically complex plants, techniques and traditions for accessing a world invisible to the rest of us, a world of forces and information that is transhuman, supernatural, if the word means anything. But this supernatural dimension is anchored in the plants that live in our world. And my brother was a botanist, and I had botanical training. As we studied the psychoactive plants of the world, especially the New World tropics, where they seem to be concentrated, we were simultaneously exalted by the realization that we had found a doorway, a real doorway into hyperspace, and at the same time tremendously upset and alarmed by the fact that this doorway is in the process of being dismantled by the forces of human ignorance that are not even aware of its existence. So this was the impulse behind the decision on the part of my partner Kat and I that these plants must be saved. They must be preserved in germplasm repositories or botanical gardens or something like that, toward a day when they can be studied and the power, the dimensions within them, can be given their real weight. So to this end, we founded a botanical garden in Hawaii that is specifically dedicated to preserving plants with a history of shamanic importance. And I mention this because this is the real world political work that we do, and everything else I will say today will be barely anchored in any world familiar to most of us. But there is a political anchoring, there is a place where it all comes tangential to the World Bank and the IMF and the host governments and so forth and so on. It is tremendously important to preserve this shamanic option, if for no other reason than we do not know what it is. We do not know what it is. Well, so at the break, if you come up, the newsletter of our botanical garden is the large stack of beige paper, and there are 300 copies of that, so I hope there's enough for for everyone. We do exist on donations, so if any of you are philanthropists, we can certainly tell you how to spend your money. We have many plans for your money. Okay. I wasn't kidding about what an honor I think it is to address the Jung Society. At one point in my life, my greatest desire was to become a Jungian analyst. And I had the good fortune of coming upon Jung very young. I was about 15 when a very precocious friend of mine brought Psychology and Alchemy in the Carrie F. Baines translation. I think it had just been brought out. And we were stunned, and we read it from cover to cover, and then went on to Mysterium Conjunctionis, Ion, the studies in the phenomenology of the self. I said to someone yesterday, we read all the books of Jung that the Jungians never read. They seem to stop up there toward the front of the line with the archetypes of the collective unconscious and the personality type. But to my mind, it was the late stuff that was fascinating. And I am slightly puzzled, and we were talking about it last night, at the distance between the Jungian community and the psychedelic community, because they seem to me, the unschooled observer, to be definitely sharing the same concerns, and strangely enough, they share much of the same history and geography. Basel was, of course, Jung's hometown. It was Albert Hoffman's hometown. Did one half of town know what the other half was doing? I'm not sure. The relationship of Jung to the unconscious, to the collective unconscious as its discoverer, has been always somewhat puzzling to me, because, of course, if you know the history of 20th century art, you know that Dada, which was the great prefigurative movement for surrealism, rose in Zurich. So, we've got LSD, the schools of modern art that laid great stress on the irrational, and the great schools of psychology that extended the boundaries of the unconscious, all rattling around in these little Swiss towns. And it's interesting to imagine conversations or meetings that might have taken place when people slightly left their ordinary habits and wandered into bars they didn't know and drank with people they'd never met before. Because Jung provided maps of the unconscious, and at 16, when we were beginning to experiment with this, and let me stress, this was before the great social waves of LSD taking of the 1960s. Just preceding that, from about 1963 to 65, we were frantic for maps of the unconscious. And Freud was useless. I mean, the notion that the contents of the psychedelic experience could be reduced to what Freud called day residues and repressed sexual desire and stuff like that didn't wash. Within 10 minutes you could tell that was not a serviceable metaphor. Jung, on the other hand, offered a vast pantheon of gods and archetypes and psychic complexes forgotten or abandoned. I mean, I thought of Jung basically as what I call a noetic archaeologist, someone who goes with toothbrush and nut pick to dig away the detritus from the bones of vanished idea systems. And if any of you have ever read the works of Jung in the Bollingen set, you know that the richness of it is all in the footnotes. I mean, here was a man who raised the footnote to a high art and who was aware of a literature that nobody else, to my mind, seemed to know about. that Jung's references reach 1,000 years deep into the past with great density of reference. I mean, this is where I learned about Macrobius and Dositheus and Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagus, and all those folks that you just never hear about. It was my introduction to the underbelly of Western civilization was through Jung. Well, to my mind, and now I'll theme this in to today's theme, I think Maria mentioned that Jung did not have a lot to say about shamanism. He came to it late in his life, and he had already worked through the exegesis of the symbol systems of the European mind. And so he was sort of content to indicate shamanism as an area where more work was to be done. And then the great follow-on scholar was Merciliade, who then actually studied shamanism, showed what its archetypal underpinnings were in all times and places, and the combination of Jung and Iliade, I think, pretty much delivered us as firm a map of the psyche, as dependable a map of the psychic geography as we can expect to have until we make the trip ourselves and readjust the landscape with our own notes and observations. For Jung, the great path into the unconscious was alchemy. And alchemy is an interesting, pivotal domain, because I think we could, in a way, say it lies halfway between the concerns of an archaic shamanism and halfway between the concerns of a quasi-scientific psychedelic attempt to explore consciousness. Merciliade wrote a brilliant book on alchemy called The Forge and the Crucible, which is the bridge to show you how you go from Jungian psychology into an understanding of alchemy that approximates Iliade. The notion for the alchemists that Jung brought forth very strongly was the idea of projection of psychic contents, projection of the active imagination onto processes and objects in the exterior world. In the case of the alchemists, it was the swirling chemical processes in their alembics, in their alchemical vessels, that they projected the great round of the archetypes on to these chemical processes. They saw crystallization, sublimation, separation as statements about the contents of the psyche as much as statements about the exterior world, because for them the firm division between mind and matter, the firm ontological division between mind and matter that is built into Western thinking now, did not exist. That comes with René Descartes, with the invention of what's called the res extensa, the extended world, and the res verans, the interior world, which has no spatial extension. So for the alchemists, mind and matter were two terms whose mutual exclusivity could be blurred under certain circumstances, and the terms of one could migrate toward the other. Well, now we as moderns ordinarily only experience this state when we are intoxicated by hallucinogenic drugs, or when we are in a state of severe psychic weakness, when there is then overwhelmment from the unconscious that is not with the permission of the ego, as happens in the psychedelic experience. Well, all of these various ways of approaching the psyche seem fairly abstract and bloodless and removed from daily existence unless the psychedelic experience is present. And then it vivifies these metaphors. It makes clear what these various perennial traditions are talking about. So what I thought I would try to do today, and you're welcome to try and steer it other directions in the question and answer period, is the workshop is Sacred Plants as Guides. A lot of information has to be imparted if we're going to satisfy my pedagogical urge here, because I would really like to leave you with information that you didn't have before, some of which may have practical efficacy in your own life. So in thinking about this very large issue, Sacred Plants as Guides, I basically break it down into three categories for ease of handling in a context like this. And they are a kind of survey. How many of these plants are there? What are the chemicals that drive them? And what is their geographical distribution? In other words, just what are the botanical facts of the matter? And then, secondly, I think in order to understand what these things mean for spiritual growth and psychic development, you have to place them in a context. And the context is chronological and historical. Have these things always been around? Have shamans always been taking them? How do they relate to the synthetic drugs that have been developed in the last couple of centuries? So the history of our relationship to the pharmacologically induced ecstasy. And then finally, and probably we'll get to this this afternoon, the phenomenology of the experience and the techniques for achieving and controlling it. Because this is there is a practicum here. This is not a course in Mongolian philology or something like that. The ultimate idea is to get those who feel called to the task sufficiently informed and psychically empowered that they can push off into the oceans of mind in the interior with some fair amount of confidence that they'll return to port with all hands. So let's start sort of with a survey. Let me see, I'm going to talk until 11:30. So let's start with the survey then, and just talk about what the options are. And this will be sort of unstructured and conversational with forays into other areas. First of all, the striking thing when you want to study psychoactive drugs and plants and their impact on human culture, and that's really what interests me, is how drugs affect culture. After I went through Jung and Iliad, my next port of call was McLuhan. And I absorbed very deeply the notion that media structure civilizations in ways that the civilizations are never aware of. And Jung, of course, talked about print and manuscript and electronic culture. He did not talk about drugs. But drugs are a form of media, because information travels through the drug to the mind. That's a medium of communication. And various societies wear drugs like clothing with no awareness of their existence at all, somewhat in the way that a fish relates to water. So that, for instance, if you're in Dublin, you are swimming in the ambiance of an alcohol culture. You don't have to be drunk to be in Dublin, although it helps. But the entire society is premised on the possibility, you see. The entire society is premised on the possibility. In India, the entire society is premised on the possibility of hashish intoxication. And social mores, building design, everything takes account of this. Cultures don't see this. We do not think of ourselves as a meat, sugar, alcohol culture. People do not walk around saying, oh wow, I'm so high on meat, alcohol, and sugar, I can hardly stand it. But they are. And certain consequences flow from that. So as I make my way through this survey, you need to bear in mind that a culture takes its tone, its clothing, from the drugs that it admits, and you can know a great deal about a culture from the drugs that it excludes, the drugs that it excoriates and fears, because various drugs accentuate and suppress different parts of the psyche. So these are statements about anxiety, about various parts of the psyche. The striking thing when you set out to do a cultural survey like this is you discover that our culture, the culture of Europe, for most of us, some of us are black, some of us are Asian, but largely the roots of American culture lie in Europe. This is the most pharmacologically impoverished cultural area on the entire planet. It has the longest history of disconnection from any kind of ecstatic intoxication. And the cultural forms of Europe, linear, abstract, narcissistic, and promoting of male dominance, are, to my mind, exactly what you would expect in a culture long deprived of the boundary-dissolving, numinous encounter with the vegetable mind. So a lot of the cultural problems we're dealing with are based on the fact that we as Europeans have no place for drugs. We don't really know quite what to do with that. As you move south from Europe into the continent of human origins, Africa, you discover that while Africa supports a tropical ecosystem, which, because that means increased speciation of plants, you would think would indicate an increased number of hallucinogens, Africa is surprisingly poor in hallucinogens. This is not well understood. As we go through this survey, I will make reference to numerous unsolved mysteries in the field. And I always try to do this because I'm hoping that there are graduate students listening who are looking for research topics. And there are numerous research areas where important work can be done. One of them is this question of the poverty of hallucinogens in Africa. Why? Does it have something to do with the extreme length of time that Africa has been subject to human impact? Probably. Because Africa is species poor generally for a tropical continent. However, in the interest of thoroughness, there is one hallucinogenic drug complex that should be mentioned because it raises issues that are important for the broader context, and that is ibogaine, or Tabernantha iboga, the so-called Bawiti cults of Zaire and Gabon. Now, this is the psychedelic about which we in the West probably know the least. It has spawned no waves of social hysteria. It has not been the subject of pogroms or media freakout. It's a powerful hallucinogen, and it's not only a powerful hallucinogen, but it has a component of sexual excitation to it, which is ancillary and unusual. If you actually have ever looked into the subject of aphrodisiacs, the truth is there ain't any. There are things which cause genital itching and prolonged erection and so forth, but a true aphrodisiac, a chemical which would impel you to want to have sex, there's nothing quite like that, except this Tabernantha iboga is very interesting. We tend to think of an aphrodisiac because we tend to break our heart away from our genitals as a kind of a cold thing, I think. But when you talk to these people who are taking ibogaine, they don't talk about aphrodisiac. They say this causes open-heartedness, one-heartedness, they call it. And one-heartedness is what they are striving for in the Bhawiti cult, and they achieve it. And they achieve it, and it allows them to resist cultural incursions by Christian missionaries. Bhawiti is the main cultural force that is holding back conversion to Christianity by these people. Fang culture, the people who are using this ibogaine, it's an interesting culture. There's a great deal of anxiety in Fang culture about divorce and relationships between men and women. Divorce is very easily obtained among the Fang, but it's always followed by extremely lengthy and protracted negotiations with the family of the divorced partner about return of dowry. And a huge amount of neurosis and agony and murder and violence goes on over these dowry return negotiations. The ibogaine stands right in the middle of this as a source of one-heartedness, making divorce less likely. So it's very important as a force for social cohesion. And I mention this because when we reach ayahuasca, we will see, when we reach South America, we will see ayahuasca functioning not as an aphrodisiac or a thing to unify couples, but as a kind of telepathic pheromone that unifies whole small tribal groups together into a one-hearted, one-minded modality. And if we get into a discussion of the possible evolutionary impact of hallucinogens, we'll see that it always lies in the direction of these collectivized states of mind and dissolution of boundaries between people. Other than Tabernanthe iboga, Africa's hallucinogens are trivial, and I won't mention them in the time we have. Cannabis is in Africa as well, but cannabis is worldwide now and probably has been for quite some time. Cannabis is a special case chemically and culturally. We tend to think of cannabis as a recreational drug, but that's because in the 20th century we always smoke our cannabis. In the 18th and 19th century, cannabis was eaten, and jellied forms of cannabis that were eaten, judging by the prose of people like Theodore Gautier, Baudelaire, Fitzhugh Ludlow, and people like that, it was as powerful as LSD, without doubt. I mean, these people were being swept into titanically alien dimensions. Well, when we cross from Africa to India, interestingly, of course, as you all know, tremendous depth of at least concern with the spiritual dimension, if not realization of it. That's a tougher call. India would be a likely place to look for indigenous hallucinogenic plant cults simply because of the spiritual obsession that characterizes Indian thought. When we look at the historical foundations of Indian thought, we find that it all rests on a group of texts composed between 4,500 and 2,000 years ago called the Vedas. And the Vedas are nothing less but the world's longest continuing advertisement for a hallucinogenic plant. The problem is we don't know what this plant is. This is the mysterious soma of the Rig Vedas. And Mandala 9 of the Rig Veda is entirely a hymn to Soma. Soma held Hinduism of the Vedic phase together. Later, it was repressed. And again, graduate students, pay attention. One of the very interesting problems to be looked at by sociologists, social psychologists, and anthropologists is How, if a drug once discovered, or a plant once discovered, is so wonderful, how can these things ever be lost or forgotten? And yet, in several instances, we deal with literatures which sing the praises of some plant or drug, the identity of which we cannot figure out, or it becomes a big arm wrestle between various competing schools of scholarship. We do not, to this day, know what soma was. Gordon Wasson, who some of you may know as the discoverer, the modern discoverer of the mushroom cults of Mexico, founder of the science of ethnomycology, believed to his dying breath that soma was Amanita muscaria, the red-topped, white-speckled amanita. This is a mushroom which has a major role in Tungusic and Arctic shamanism, but to say, as Wasson did, that this is the supreme entheogen of all time is not supported by the evidence, I think. Wasson's own efforts to become intoxicated on Amanita muscaria were not successful. My efforts have not been successful. Occasionally you will hear anecdotal evidence. Someone will tell a story about eating Amanita muscaria that obviously they had a staggering breakthrough, to a rupture of plane, as Mircea in his wonderful phrase. But it's extremely undependable. And when you look at the botany of Amanita muscaria, you discover that its chemical constituency is seasonally variant, genetically variant, geographically variant, and so forth. So often, I think, as we gain understanding of a given shamanism, we will see that it depended on an extremely deep local knowledge. And if you take what a Yakut shaman says about Amanita muscaria and attempt to apply it in the national forests of New Mexico, you could end up with a tag on your toe. These things this kind of information doesn't travel well. One of the, there are old shamans and bold shamans, but there are no old, bold shamans. In looking at the Indian subcontinent for other hallucinogens that may have made a contribution, the obvious one, to my mind, is Stropharia cubensis, the mushroom which grows in the dung of cows, and that the book my brother and I wrote was about. Other possibilities, some of you may know that there are a family of the Argyria family of morning glories, an Asian family of morning glories distributed from India to Micronesia. 13 species, all containing psychoactive ergot alkaloids, none with a history of human usage. Now, this is another area which really fascinates me. Why do some plants become discovered by human beings and become the objects of cults which last millennia, and others are never discovered at all in societies absolutely obsessed with spiritual advancement? This Argyria nervosa is a perfect example, because you take the seeds are the active part, and you don't need much of this thing. You need 4 or 5 seeds, less than a tablespoon of plant material, which I would bet would make it, per unit volume, probably one of the most powerful hallucinogens in nature. And the hallucinations are absolutely stunning, and nobody has ever claimed this. It's free for the taking. This means you can cut a deal with an ally that doesn't belong to the Hindus, the Mayans, or the somebody else. It's an unoccupied parking space in hyperspace. And It's very interesting. The discoveries are continuous. Just a year ago, some phytochemists in the Midwest discovered a plant. It's always been there. Nobody's ever taken it very seriously, treated it like a weed. Desmanthus illinoiensis, the Illinois bundleweed. This is suggestive that it's called bundleweed because a medicine bundle is, of course, a shaman's mojo bag, you know. But so bundleweed, 6% by dry weight, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, the largest concentration of DMT in any plant, and unclaimed by native peoples, unknown to the folk medicine of the North American Indians as far as we can tell. Well, so this is very interesting. Continuing our survey, since we're now somewhere on the Eurasian continent, we should mention Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. With cannabis, this is probably the oldest human narcotic known. In the later phase of Minoan civilization was entirely based on opium, on the use of opium. And in fact, when Michael Ventris translated the tablets, the Linear B tablets, they got these tallies, and they thought at first that the symbol for opium must be the symbol for wheat, because the tallies were so huge of the stuff being moved and sold. And then when they sorted out, they realized, no, for the last 1,000 years of its existence, the Minoan civilization drifted deeper and deeper into an opium narcosis that was its way, I think, of anesthetizing the pain of the death of this last outpost of the goddess religion, because that's what it was. It was a cultural anachronism. While Asia Minor had gone over to god-kings, city-states, and bronze-tipped spears, the people of Minoan Crete had kept the old, archaic religion that came out of Africa. And then in the last gasp of that Minoan culture, those mysteries were handed on to the mainland of Greece and became the mysteries at Eleusis and other cult sites. It was said by the commentators, contemporary commentators of the Hellenistic world, the rites practiced in secret at Eleusis are practiced in public at Knossos. And this was the difference, you know, the going underground of the old proto-Minoan mother religion. In modern times, we have a horror of opium. I mean, people are amazed that I even mention it in the same breath, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves that this virulently addictive substance, opium, was not even noticed to be addictive by anybody until 1627, when the English physician John Playfair, for the first time, commented that opium, once taken over a long period of time, then there would be a requirement that it be taken throughout life. We're right in the middle of a drug war at the moment, and it's interesting in that context to notice how the goals of drug wars can change. 100 years ago, the British Navy was involved in what was called the Opium Wars in China. Very few people in the modern world have bothered to inform themselves to find out that the Opium Wars were about the right of the British government to deal opium. The Emperor of China did not want opium dealt in the ports of China, and the British government used cannon to enforce their desire to sell opium in the ports of China. Why were the English trying to sell opium in the ports of China? Because the tea trade had collapsed through overproduction, and they were stuck with all these tea ships. They had created a whole global infrastructure for the sale of tea. When the market fell out on tea, they just turned to opium. They grew it in Goa, and they sold it in China. And this was government policy less than 120 years ago. Okay, well, moving on then from Eurasia, and I'm sure I'm missing different things, but if I missed your favorite thing, bring it up in the question period, to the North American continent. And the North American continent is, I almost said similarly cursed like Europe, but that's just my prejudice. The North American continent is similarly poor in hallucinogens. There are no very interesting hallucinogens in North America, and North American Indians, North American culture, did not avail itself of this ecstatic plant-induced shamanism. It tended more to go for what's called ordeal shamanism, the Sundance thing where you hang yourself by your pectorals on hooks and stuff like that. I mean, there are other ways to attain these visions. But you see, that absence of good hallucinogens in North America just reinforced that whole beer and woolen and uptight thing that came from Europe. The only major hallucinogen to have a role in Native American culture is, of course, peyote. And many people, without informing themselves, imagine that peyote is something which goes millennia into the past, and this is absolutely not true. Peyote use may well be less than 1,000 years old among Native Americans. When you go back into the old graves and the old burial sites in the Rio Grande Valley and south, you don't find peyote. What you find are the beans of Sephora secundifolia. You all probably know this plant, though you may not know its name. It's the plant that produces the very hard red and black bean that they can string. If you all know what collarines are, these are erythrinas, which are related to these things. Okay, that stuff contains cytosine and cysteine. These are what are called ordeal poisons. And it might be worthwhile to just talk for a minute about ordeal poisons. I said there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to have this experience that shoves you through to an awareness of the numinous. That's what we're trying to do, is have an awareness of the numinous. Well, in certain parts of the world where hallucinogens were not present in the biome, people concentrated on ordeal poisons. And what an ordeal poison is it's a chemical compound that you take it and you think you're going to die and you beg for death and you do not die. You get better, you're fine. And you're so damn glad to be alive that you undergo an abreaction. You get straight, you shed some of your complexes, and you turn over a new leaf, is what it is. Well, in Madagascar, these ordeal poisons have been brought to a high state of perfection. Also in Malaya, there's a poison complex that replaces a hallucinogenic drug complex, and these are horrific poisons. So what apparently was going on in the Rio Grande Valley was, after centuries of this Sephora secundifolia cult, someone discovered peyote and said, "My God, thank God." And then the other plant which was big in the Southern California, northern Mexico, and across the Southwest were the tropane-containing daturas, the so-called Tolach religion of Southern California. Well, these are deliriant confusants that are, unless you have a psychic constitution that is not like mine, you can't take these things. They're I just found them confusing. It was like a kind of madness, and also physically very difficult to handle. I experimented. I had a phase with these things when I was in Nepal because there are sadhus, holy men in the Kathmandu Valley, who swear by this stuff. And if you're in Kathmandu, you may notice in the gutter, well, you'll notice plenty in the gutter, but you may also notice these datura pods, empty datura pods, and I noticed them and started asking questions. And then out at the King's Game Preserve past Pashupatinath, I found a bunch of these things and laid in a supply. And but it is an occult, watery, it's a dimension of confusion, not a dimension of high awareness. And I think some of you have heard me tell the story about the reason I gave it up was an Englishman, a friend of mine who lived in this little village in Nepal where I lived. He was also experimenting with this stuff. And one day I was buying potatoes and tomatoes in the market, and I ran into him, and we started having a conversation. And in the course of the conversation, he revealed that he believed we were in his apartment. And then I knew that we were losing hold on our grounding. So I don't recommend that. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. Apparently, it's a thing for magic, power magic. And I've never been particularly interested in that because I'm afraid of it. I'm a watcher. I like to look. I like to get very close to it and watch it, but I'm not into grabbing it or doing anything with it. I have a feeling that would lead to catastrophe for me personally. Okay, where are we now? Northern Mexico. Now we've gone all around. We started in Europe, we went down into Africa, across the Eurasian continent, North America, northern Mexico. Now things get interesting, because as you leave the Sonoran uplands and go south, in the Sierra Mazateca, it is this mushroom complex, which Valentina and Gordon Wasson discovered in the 1953s. 17 to 22 species, it depends on who's counting, of extremely endemic, meaning very localized species of mushrooms, all producing psilocybin, coincident with the cultural site of the Mayan, Mixtec, and Mazatecan civilizations. And this is psilocybin, an extraordinarily powerful, visionary, and benign hallucinogenic metabolite. Once the Wassons had nailed down this Mexican mushroom complex, then people started checking, and they discovered these mushrooms or conspecific species in many localities. Two that are worth mentioning are the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, which appears to be the world center for species density of the psilocybin gene, and strangely enough, very good ethnographic research turns up no hint that these Kwakiutl, Shimsham, Tlingit, and other people had any hint of this. They lived in the center of the psilocybin distribution complex, and as far as we can tell, their shamanism, which was highly evolved, never discovered or made use of this. Not so these civilizations of Mesoamerica. The other place where these mushrooms have now been discovered, and the range seems to be extending every year, is Europe. The tragedy of European civilization is that the logos was apparently there all the time. The English countryside, I understand, is now practically a scene of annual mushroom runs that are not unlike the lemming runs of Scandinavia. And everybody pours out to collect the semi-lanceata mushrooms. I've been told, I haven't been to these sites, but I've been told that Ionia, where the Book of Kells was composed and where St. Columba went, is covered with mushrooms. It's very clearly a mushroom ecology. Attention, graduate students. The tracing of mushroom motifs in European art and civilization and culture is an extremely rich, untapped field. If you need some clues, look at family escutcheons, look at family crests. In France and the Italian parts of France, the Morelli family has the morel on their escutcheon. There are other mushroom families and mushroom names. So there may have been, this may have been the struggle between paganism and Christianity may have revolved around a mushroom. We know Druids were into plants. We know they were into oak groves, but the plant that is always mentioned as the Druidic psychedelic psychic plant of choice is mistletoe. But mistletoe is chemically very disappointing. And I've wondered if mistletoe is not, it wasn't the plant they wanted to symbolize the symbiosis of one plant upon another. It's that the mistletoe symbolizes epiphytic existence. Anyway, this is an untapped area. Once you get into the New World tropics, then you are in the great domain of the hallucinogenic plants. And no one knows why it is that the tropics of the New World are tremendously rich in hallucinogens. I mean, I don't know how many of you are botanists or biologists, but try to imagine figuring out a set of evolutionary constraints that were operating on one side of the planet but not on the other. When we take, for instance, the jungles of southern Colombia and compare them with, let us say, the jungles of New Guinea, these are both continental floras, both equatorial, both climaxed at a species-rich climax, and one has dozens of hallucinogens in it, and the other has none. None. This is not well understood. I mean, theories range as wildly as, obviously, that South America must be where the flying saucer landed. And, that's where the genes were seeded. I confess I'm not sure why it is. At first I thought that it had to do with the extremely primitive state, so-called primitive, the extremely archaic state of culture in the South American jungles, that they represent a real Stone Age culture, where when you go into Indonesia, it may look primitive to you, but the Dutch were there before the English arrived in North America. It has had centuries and centuries in which these things could be forgotten. But of course, then come the botanists who care nothing for ethnographic data and who simply carry out plant surveys and chemical analysis of plants. They can't find these hallucinogens either. So this is a great mystery. In the tropics of Mesoamerica and the equatorial tropics of the New World, there's a vast panoply of hallucinogens, not only the mushroom complex, but then also this ayahuasca or yahe complex that we've referred to several times. This is a huge jungle vine. And as we cross into the yahe area, we also cross an interesting barrier, because we move from plants, single plants, which are hallucinogenically active, into the realm of preparations. We're on the threshold of the concept drug here, because what ayahuasca is two plants which are not active unless brought into combination with each other. One plant contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and the other plant contains DMT, which would be destroyed in the gut if taken orally, unless it were taken orally in the presence of an MAO inhibitor. Well, this was not understood by Western pharmacology until 1956, but it was understood by Amazonian shamans millennia ago. So they bring these two things together, and by varying the ratio between the plant containing the beta-carbolines that inhibit MAO and the plants that contain DMT, they can intensify or de-emphasize the visions. Well, most of the hallucinogens in the Amazon basin run on tryptamine of some sort, usually DMT. In the upper basin of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, like that, you get these yahe ayahuasca beverages. These are things you drink, and then it comes on. You have these outlandish trips. As you go down into the lower basin, the Banisteriopsis cult gives way to these snuff cults, Ibina and Niopo, depending on the languages. These don't depend on an MAO inhibitor for their activity because they're absorbed through the subnasal mucosa, which is an extremely effective way for getting drugs into the system. The problem with that complex, the snuff complex, is that we are just physically such delicate and wimpy people that we can't stand that route of drug administration, because what they do is they toast these seeds of Anodonanthera peregrina, this huge leguminous tree which is the source of the seeds. They toast these seeds and powder them, so what you get is a kind of rough cross between sawdust and charcoal. And then they have a hollow tube about this long, and they load it up with this stuff, and you squat down and put the tube into your nostril, and your friend, not you, because you would not do it hard enough. Your friend then takes a huge breath of air, and it's just like being hit in the face with a 2x4. I mean, it's like being hit in the face. And you fall over backwards, you scream, you salivate, you squirm around there in the dirt for a minute or two. And then you sit back up, and by that time, the tube has been reloaded for the other nostril. And then, and your eyes, your sinuses can't believe what's happening to you. So you have to sort out this whole sinus shock, which is going on in parallel with then an evolving strange state of mind, which is beginning to take over and clarify everything. And then there are numerous minor variations on these themes. Might talk just a little bit about the chemistry of these things and the chemistry of hallucinogens generally. My attitude toward this question of plants, compounds, drugs, should these things be used for spiritual growth? If the answer is no, then that finishes. You don't have to go any further. If the answer is maybe or yes, then other questions arise. Which compounds out of this whole survey, and at what frequency, and at what dosage, and under what circumstances? And over the years, I've sort of evolved a three-way test that I will share with you, because I think it's maybe operationally the most useful thing you'll hear this weekend. And that is, if you are contemplating some compound, some plant, then the first thing to ask yourself is, does it occur in nature? Does it have some tangentiality to what is already existing? Because obviously what exists, that's nature, has undergone some vast winnowing process out of the set of all things which might exist. in that wonderful phrase of Alfred North Whitehead's, certain things have undergone the formality of actually occurring. You know, and so certain compounds have undergone the formality of actually occurring in the biological matrix, and so they should be our pool out of which our experimental compound should be drawn. But this is thousands of compounds. How can we further narrow it? Well, an excellent way of narrowing it further is to ask the question of this compound: does it have a history of human usage? Does it have a history of human usage? That is your FDA approval. Because if you can point to a tribe of people who have been taking this plant or mushroom or whatever it is for millennia, and they don't have miscarriages, tumors, cataracts, blindness, Down syndrome, 8 fingers on the left hand, or whatever it is, then you can be fairly confident that this thing is benign, that these people have observed its action on pregnant women, the elderly, those with, you know, and that it has passed that test. Then, finally, the narrowest gate through which a compound has to go to intersect my precious body is it has to have an affinity to ordinary brain chemistry. It has to have an affinity to ordinary brain chemistry. We don't want to launch something on your brain that it can't recognize at all, that it has no biosynthetic pathways to degrade, that it has no receptors for just some crazy thing, you know, 5-amino-3-triethylphenthioanaxidine or something. We don't want that. There's not the spirit that we're acting in here. So if the compound can get through those 3 barriers, then it's an excellent candidate for providing spiritual gain at low physiological impact. Well, now some people may say, oh, well, you've taken all the fun out of it. All the good things have been tossed aside in this mad rush to purity or something. Not at all. The very best stuff was retained in this process because in terms of relative strength and bizarreness of effect and so forth, the strangest, the most powerful, the most transformative of all hallucinogens in nature or out is dimethyltryptamine, DMT. And it's worth talking about DMT for a moment because it will raise certain issues and distinctions that you may not have been aware of. First of all, DMT is hands down the most powerful of all hallucinogens. I mean, it is so powerful that whatever's in second place is lost over the horizon. Yet, it is the most benign of all hallucinogens because it occurs as an endogenous neurotransmitter in the normal human brain. We, every single one of us at this moment, have N,N-dimethyltryptamine being synthesized, activated, and degraded in our synaptic membrane. So this is almost a paradox. The most benign of all hallucinogens, the most fast-acting, I should also add, is also the most harmless, the easiest to take. It sort of puts a certain obligation on the experient because there is no reason to hold back except that there is this question, does it drive you mad? And then the more serious version of that question, what about the possibility of death by astonishment? This is no joke. Death by astonishment is, I think, probably the major risk we run with this stuff because the impact of the breakthrough is so total, so complete, so unexpected. And in a way, this sort of brings me back around to my theme, because I encountered DMT, LSD, all of these things in that very period when I was getting set to take flight as a Jungian analyst. And what completely blew my mind about DMT, and I mention it again, here's an opportunity for research, is how here's a heretical construction, how trans-archetypal the content of the flash seemed. I was appalled because not only had I a certain amount of interest in Jung and proclivity along those lines, but my original major had been art history. Art historians, what we're trained to do is to be able to look at a motif and say, oh yes, I'm familiar with this from ceramic from second millennia Peru, and also Mandaean embroidery work. We know motifs. We're trained to recognize and connect disparate aesthetic domains. Well, when I smoked DMT and came down, I said, this is not on the map. I can't believe it. This doesn't connect up to anything. How can there be domains of the human mind that do not announce themselves in folklore, fairy tales, dreams, or mandala painting, that are so removed from the ven of what is human that they are apparently not accessible in structuring our maps of ourself and our psyche? And that for me was the contact with what I call, and I didn't call it this, Rudolf Otto called it this, and this term influenced Jung, Otto preceded Jung, it is the wholly other. And if there is an archetype of the wholly other, then this is it. But perhaps the wholly other transcends the archetypes. This may explain to some degree Jung's interest in Gnosticism, especially the Valentinian school of Gnosticism, which holds, that there is a higher and hidden Father, all God, who is outside the machinery of cosmic fate. And it seemed to me that in those extremely profound DMT flashes, I was actually witnessing a domain outside the machinery of the archetypes, which is, for us as moderns, that's what the machinery of fate is. It's not zodiacal machinery, it's hardwiring in our psychology and our genes that gives us our fate. Well, so having said that, I've not only made the survey, but also brought us to, by ending with DMT, the subject matter of this quest. And I want to make it clear, I speak about the power of the psychedelic experience because I think people should be informed of their birthright. And I feel very antsy around the notion that someone might go from birth to the grave without ever having a psychedelic experience. It makes me as antsy as the notion that somebody might go from birth to the grave without having a sexual experience. It's a strange kind of protective denial, or a kind of expression of fear. This is our birthright. This is part of what it means to be human. These altered states of consciousness, I think, are pretty much scripted into the existence of women because most of them will give birth, which is an organically scripted psychedelic experience from which there is no escape unless, of course, you go for the drug knockout, the spinal, and then you miss everything. But biologically, physiologically, women are set up for this experience. Men are not. It's possible to build such barriers against overwhelmment that it never happens in your whole life. And I believe that if we psychologically analyze the effects of these psychedelics, what they do is they dissolve boundaries. That's all. I mean, if you interview 10,000 people who've had a psychedelic trip, each one has their own hierophany, their own hieroskamos that unfolded for them, but the sum total of it is boundaries dissolve. And then whatever's on the other side of your boundary comes flooding in to claim you and to reshape and remake your psyche. Well, I see the entire illness of our civilization as an ego-inflationary illness. We have gone so sick with ego that we are literally murdering the planet rather than confronting the consequences of our psychic imbalance. And the psychedelics act to redress this. They are almost an inoculation against the ego. And I see the ego as a phenomenon arising in historical time, or rather actually history is caused by the ego. But the ego is a component of the psyche that arose in the post-archaic phase, in the post-psychedelic phase. It's entirely a modern invention. It's less than 15,000 years old. And the assumptions of the ego are the source of our neurosis, our disequilibrium. Why did the ego arise? It arose because of the climatologically enforced abandonment of these psychedelic religions of the archaic period. In other words, here is the scenario as I see it. Primates, even primitive, non-advanced primates like squirrel monkeys, howler monkeys, these kinds of primates, all have male dominance hierarchies. The whole thing with primates is about male dominance. But a lot of things about human beings mark us as the most unique member of the primate group. Obviously, we look different from any other monkeys. Even the stranger monkeys look more like the normal monkeys than we look like them, or they look like us. Our upright posture. The other thing about us is our suppressed estrus cycle. We cannot tell at a glance whether a woman is in heat or not. And yet, obviously, that had a tremendous shaping force on the social psychology of the primates. I believe that everything about us that is noble and worth saving occurs against the grain. That if we had followed the grain, we would still be competing with jackals for the carcasses left by lions of large game kills on the plains of Africa. But when the African continent began to dry up and we were forced out of the trees where we had an arboreal vegetarian lifestyle, we came under great pressure to expand our diet. And I believe that the great unstudied factor in human evolution and human emergence is the effect of a complex diet on our emerging species. And it's not only the presence of hallucinogens such as psilocybin in the diet, but other things as well. Psilocybin is the most spectacular case, and if you came to see Darwin, you'd have to hear about evolution. So you came to see me, so you have to hear this little theory about human emergence. Most of you can probably recite it by heart now. But it's a three-step feedback loop from a fairly bright monkey to a fairly stupid human being. And the way it works like this: these monkeys come down out of the trees. They're predating on kills of ungulate mammals made by lions. They're competing with jackals. They're testing all the foods in the environment, and lo and behold, in the manure of these ungulate mammals that are irradiating across the African continent, there are what are called coprophytic mushrooms. And the presence of large amounts of tryptophan in manure as a substrate means that these coprophytic mushrooms elaborate psilocybin. So here in this new grassland environment are the psilocybin mushrooms. Well, these proto-hominid creatures testing foods for their diet would reach the psilocybin and would test it. Well, then this three-part feedback loop to humanness then comes into play. And it works like this. Very, very light doses of psilocybin, so light that you cannot an hour and a half or 2 hours later tell you've taken anything. You say, I don't feel it, I feel completely normal, I must not have taken enough. That dose, if you would submit yourself to being tested by an optometric apparatus, we could show you that your vision has improved slightly. This is an effect of eating small amounts of psychoactive amines, increase of visual acuity. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if you're a hunting animal competing in a highly competitive environment and suddenly somebody hands you a pair of chemical binoculars, you are going to be a more successful hunter than other members of your species who are not availing themselves of this food item. So there was reinforcement there. Aha! If we eat these mushrooms in small amounts, we will be more successful hunters. Or maybe it was never raised to consciousness as an if-then relationship. It was just, we eat mushrooms, we hunt well, kind of thing. Then, if you eat slightly more of the psilocybin, if you bring slightly more of it into your diet, it's what's called a CNS stimulator, central nervous system stimulant. An effect of all CNS stimulants is what's called arousal. And arousal means simply that you can't sit still, you're very restless, you're very energetic, and often in the male animal you have an erection. It's an overall systemic arousal. And if you witness this situation in monkeys are very hang loose kind of characters, and so then they just all fall together in a heap and make love. And this increases what anthropologists and primatologists like to call successful instances of copulation. This means that this increased interest in sex, in combination with an increased success in obtaining food, is creating the perfect situation in which there will be a population boom of these creatures. They're eating better, they're enjoying themselves more, and they have better relationships with each other. So population boom is on the way. Well then, the next and final level is when you raise the dose higher, so you're no longer restless or interested in sex or any of that, but you're flattened with the ecstatic unfolding of the full numinous hallucinogenic rupture of plane, then, and this occurs in the tribal context, then there is boundary dissolution, group sexual activity, and group bonding and identification. And this is where this telepathic coherence, this inner dynamic of cohesion and caring that we see in primitive people to some small degree, and that we imagine must once have been our birthright, this is where it came to be. And at those higher levels of psilocybin, most of you probably know, language is formed by an organ on one side of the brain called Broca's area. Broca's area, the brain being always symmetrically constructed, Broca's area has a twin on the opposite side of the brain, but no one knows what's going on there. It's apparently a silent area of the brain. Well, when you take psilocybin, there is spontaneous linguistic activity, glossolalia. Henry Munn has written about this in his essay, The Mushrooms of Language. It's almost as though psilocybin is a pheromone that promotes linguistic activity, an effort to take verbal intentionality and connect it up to the ontos of being in some way. And then it's almost as though words are born out of you. You give birth to words. And these concrescences of meaning then create a kind of unitary ambiance which we call understanding. Language is a miracle. I mean, make no mistake about it. I don't think any amount of dissection of monkeys or human cadavers will give you any insight into language. Language is a behavior of some sort, so bizarre, so many orders of magnitude more complex than anything else we do, that for all practical purposes, this is the thumbprint of God upon creation. Human language. And it's a self-transforming thing. It keeps bootstrapping itself to higher and higher levels, and it creates for us the entire ambiance of reality. Once we had words, we quickly replaced reality with them. And so I believe that what psilocybin promotes is cognitive activity, the coordination of visual input with plans and strategies for hunting or acquisition or whatever. It promotes this increased arousal, which really, in a way, this arousal is nothing more than a reclaiming of your animal body. You feel restless, you feel your muscles, you feel your genitals, you feel your place in space and time. You are reclaiming your body, and then finally it inducts you into this domain of the logos, a religious hierophany, something that we as moderns are absolutely as in awe of as our mushroom-munching ancestors 25,000 years ago. We can't reduce it. We don't know what it is. You know, Jung was always so concerned that people say it's only psychological, it's only the psyche. I've got news for you. It may only be the psyche, but the psyche is all there is. And as we came into a relationship with the mushroom, humanness emerged on the African veldt and was able to stabilize itself for a few millennia, and then we fell into history because of climatological change, for many reasons, but we literally fell into history, and now we operate in this lower domain, a domain of limitation, of misunderstanding, of low-grade languages, and we are neurotic, we are unhappy, we are dysfunctional, and I believe this is because our connection to the logos, to the informing voice that gives meaning to being, has been broken. Over 10,000 years, it's fallen away. And all we're left with is our spiritual yearnings, our nostalgia for paradise, and our pathologies. And miraculously, we are left with the time capsule of preservation represented by the rainforest shamanic cultures that use hallucinogens. There lies our answer. but it's like the Ouroboros serpent taking its tail in its mouth. The salvation of the super future of the planet lies in a recovery of the values, modalities, and religious practices of 25 to 50,000 years ago. Break, break, break. I'm going to disappear if someone... And we haven't screened the pile, so we're just going to go through them, and I'll read them aloud. And normally I give long answers, but there's such a stack of questions here, I'll try and be General Neil and keep... or General Brief and keep it Neil. Since DMT is present in the brain, does the introduction of excess DMT shut down the production of natural DMT in the way that the body stops producing opiates during opium usage? If so, what are the effects? Is DMT really so perfectly chemically benign? The first point to make is that many of your questions cannot be answered because research into these areas is not allowed. So often we can't answer your question. This question, does the introduction of excess DMT limit endogenous production? I can say with fair confidence that that's never been studied. My guess would be that it does not, because the DMT is in no sense of the word do you become habituated to DMT. I mean, a person who does DMT once a year is a fanatically heavy user, I would say. And the question, is DMT really so chemically benign? Again, this has not been studied the way you would study with rats and so forth to determine it. But experientially speaking, the amazing thing about DMT is the speed with which you return to normal. You return to the baseline of consciousness in under 10 minutes. Well, that tells you that the brain is very well able to deal with this compound. One way of judging how toxic a drug or a plant is to ask yourself the question, how long after I take it do I feel completely normal? And with DMT, you feel completely normal 15 minutes after taking it. It's the shortest recovery time of any drug. This question is concerning the bundle weed. While it does not directly meet the criteria of long-term use, is it to be considered safe? I'd say the way to answer that question is to do a chemical analysis of the bundle weed. If there's nothing present but DMT in it, I would think it should be considered safe. Now, there may be other compounds present. In South America, it's possible to contrast two plants, Psychotria viridis, which has almost entirely nothing in it except DMT as the portion of its alkaloid fraction, or Varrola carthaginensis, which is used in the making of snuff, and chemically it's a mess. It looks like they swept the floor. You've got NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, alpha-methyltryptamine, monomethyltryptamine, 6-hydroxy-O-methyltryptamine. All of this you don't want. You want a narrow, surgical strike on the synapse is what you're going for, not splattering all kinds of junk all over the place. What is the best medium for psilocybin spore germination? Potato agar or what? The best medium is rye malt agar, no question about it. Go with rye. Organic rye malt extract. In today's climate, talk about access to shamanic pharmaceuticals for the average person. This is the where do I get it question. Dressed up in respectable terms. Well, without being too self-serving, let me say my brother and I wrote a book on cultivating mushrooms called Psilocybin, the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide by Otios and O.N. Eric. I'm Otios, as you can see. And I really believe in growing mushrooms. If you are, as you sit here, not psychically strong enough or balanced enough to take psilocybin, then if you learn to grow it at the end of that process, you will be. Because growing the mushroom teaches you cleanliness, punctuality, attention to detail, steadiness, all of these virtues, which are the very virtues you need to travel smoothly in that dimension. Other hallucinogens, other shamanic hallucinogens that you will find easily available to you without breaking any laws, the heavenly blue morning glories sold in every seed store and garden store are not to be taken. Do not take them. They have been dipped in a fungicide that will make you sick. Grow them and collect your crop and take that. And this is a major hallucinogen of great antiquity, extremely visionary. The Hawaiian wood rose. You can obtain this from people who make dried flower arrangements, often have these. Pay attention, you want the Hawaiian baby wood rose. If they try to give you something called Hawaiian wood rose, a big clunky thing, that is inactive and won't do it. The daturas are freely available. I do not recommend them. I recommend against them, but they're a common landscaping plant in Southern California, and the Jimson weed, of course, is growing out in the desert out around Lancaster and other places like that. There are a couple of companies which have very forthrightly decided to sell plants with a history of shamanic involvement. I have owned no stock in these companies, so I can recommend them without fear or favoritism. One is called Of the Jungle up in Sebastopol, California, and the other one is called Dream Gardens, and I think it's here in Santa Monica. Both of these groups publish astonishingly complete catalogs of psychoactive and shamanically important plants. Okay, that's access without going to the streets or committing crimes or anything like that. Can you tell us any more about Illinois bundleweed? I just did. And that's really all I can tell you about it. All these questions are the same question. Having convinced us of the wonder of DMT, what would be the easiest and quickest way to obtain it? How does one acquire DMT? Comment about the Supreme Court ruling against the use of peyote by North American Indians. A very bad law, obviously. Law so bad that the National Council of Churches, the National Jewish Affairs Committee, and some very large Catholic organization all filed briefs protesting this thing, and I think that it was actually realized that it was a goof, and it will be brought back in the you can't bring something back to the Supreme Court in a hurry, because then that's unseemly. But I would bet that within 5 to 10 years this will be overturned, because a close reading of this law means that wine for Pesach or communion could be construed as a psychoactive substance, and the whole thing, it was just bad law, bad idea. Has consideration been given to the possibility that, in the case of certain plants which are recounted in writings, but the identity is unknown, that the reason they are unknown is because shamans purposefully kept their identity a secret? Perhaps such secrets are still being kept. This goes to this question I raised this morning: how can a powerful hallucinogen, once discovered, ever be lost? And I've only been able to figure out one scenario in which this could happen. It happens like this. People discover a wonderful plant that imparts visions or insight or something, and everybody takes it and enjoys it, and then slowly a hierarchy emerges, a professional class, priests, and only they decree that only they will be allowed to take it. And then they lord it over the rest of society with an iron hand, and then the rest of the society gets fed up with that, and there's a slave revolt, and everybody in the ruling class is killed, and the sacrament is lost. I can't figure out any other way that it could happen. And the Vedic thing, this seems quite reasonable. Obviously, Soma was being more and more confined in its use to a single class, and then that class became viewed as obnoxious, and its overthrow and the death of this sacrament then follow each other. Perhaps such secrets are still being kept. Perhaps they are. The fact that this bundleweed could turn up at so late a date probably means that there are shamanic lineages with secrets that we don't know. As a field ethnobotanist and an explorer, I'm always interested in the unconfirmable rumor, and there are some doozies. The mysterious beetle from eastern Brazil, which causes intense hallucinogens if eaten. Here's a career for somebody. No hallucinogenic insect has ever been found, and yet there are persistent rumors in different parts of the world of either a butterfly or a beetle that is hallucinogenic. Most shamans in the Amazon, if you spend 5 or 6 weeks with them and take ayahuasca with them and tromp around with them, when you finally get to know them, they will allow as how there is another magic, which they call the magic of the big trees. And I've spent half my life trying to find out the names of the big trees, and I'm still working on it. We have collectors in Peru, and nothing is more exciting than a clump of rootstock or a seed packet that comes across our desk labeled suspect hallucinogen. That gets me to the edge of my chair. What do you think of Robert Monroe, the Journey Out of the Body Man? Well, this is a good time to discuss what do I think of all these other things on the spiritual market. I don't know what to think about them. I'm not a spiritual consumer. I've never been to a workshop that wasn't my own unless it was free. And there's a lot of stuff out there, you know, astral traveling, channeling, all of this stuff. And I tend to either believe it's bogus, or it's for people with a psychic constitution considerably different from my own. Sometimes people say to me, well, these states that you're talking about, can't they be achieved without drugs? Well, the answer to that is, my God, who would want to? What would be proved by achieving these things without drugs? If the things I'm talking about began to happen to me without drugs, I would be very, very concerned and alarmed. Because, I just don't... and also, I think there's something to be said for admitting that we cannot do it alone. That if you want this spiritual insight, if you want the Gaian matrix to welcome you, then humble yourself to the point of making a deal with a plant. That's the key. You can't enter the bank without the key to the bank. The key to the bank is a plant. Jumping up and down outside the bank and exhorting the banker to recognize your inner worth and open the door is just not going to do it. I can understand that psychoactive alkaloids are a survival mechanism for the plants. Why is that effect psychoactive in man or perhaps animal? Well, first of all, maybe we have to argue with your premise. You're right that a lot of these so-called secondary and tertiary compounds are elaborated supposedly to make things taste bad, so that birds will spit out things and stuff like that. But on the other hand, they've studied this question fairly closely, and a lot of these alkaloids are produced specifically to attract animals, to bring them in to nectaries and as pollinators and that sort of thing. Old-style botany always believes these compounds are what's called tertiary to metabolism, meaning they're kind of like waste products and not very important, garbage. But when you look carefully at a psychoactive plant, invariably what you see is that the psychoactive chemistry is going on where metabolism is most active. This is an indication that actually these things aren't tertiary at all. They are doing something for the plant, but we don't know what it is. As to why they have this peculiar effect that they do in us, I think that's because there was anciently and over the evolutionary life of human beings actually a connection between us and nature, and that these drugs are the antenna, the switches that switch us back toward the logos of the natural world. I suspect that all of nature is a seamless web of pheromonally mediated connections and interactions, and that we are just not yet at a sufficient level of analysis and sophisticated observation to see this interconnected web. You know, our idea of nature is that it's all tooth and claw, survival of the fittest and the devil take the hindmost. The new version of evolution is entirely different. It says the way you attain survival is by making yourself indispensable to everybody else. So it's not by triumphing over the ecosystem, but by integrating yourself so thoroughly into it that it can't function without you. Then you're on your way to being a dominant species, not by crushing the opposition. Let's see how we're doing here. What are deconstructionists doing to our understanding of the language? Is it helpful? By deconstructionists, I suppose you mean Jacques Derrida and that crowd. Well, I think deconstruction serves a very useful function. I think we're unaware of how thoroughly language is the medium in which we swim, how thoroughly our world is built of language. In a way, the boundary-dissolving character of the plant hallucinogens is a dissolving of language barriers. They show you that the surface of reality was not the surface of reality, it was the surface of your local language. And now it's gone, and here is what lies beneath it. At what point in the evolution of organic matter on Earth do psychoactive plants appear, and why? Interesting question. If we're talking about psychoactive fungi, we're severely limited by the fossil record because no fossil mushroom has ever been found older than 40 million years. This is because fossil mushrooms are very soft-bodied, ephemeral kind of things. As primary decomposers, which is what fungi are doing on this earth, it's reasonable to assume that they must have been here from the very beginning of the conquest of the land. But proof in the fossil record has not been forthcoming. Now, if we're talking about higher plants, flowering plants, which is mostly what we're talking about here, then no flowering plants existed before 65 million years ago. Flowering plants emerged out of the same catastrophe that destroyed the dinosaurs and set the stage for the emergence of the mammals. This is something people don't realize. Flowering plants are as recent as mammals. You know, if you look at if the period of life on Earth is visualized as a yardstick, the period of the flowering plants is the last inch and a half. And it's also the rise of the mammals occurs in that last inch and a half. So before that, the plant life on the Earth was of a very different sort, and we know nothing about its chemistry. Here's someone who asked a Zen question. What would make the present government interested in the study of psychedelics? I don't know. If they could make a buck out of it. I don't think they're very interested in psychedelics. I don't think any political... What?
CIA, they were very interested in psychedelics.
Except that they abandoned it. Yes, MK Ultra, for those of you who don't know, stands for mind control, spelled the Southern way. Mind Control Ultra was a program the CIA pursued in the 1960s where they tried out all kinds of psychedelic drugs, and they also worked with it in combination with hypnosis. They were trying to make what they called the Trojan horse. This was somebody who would be an assassin but not even know it. And how far they got with all of this, we will never know, because of course it all disappears behind the walls of secrecy. But the declassified history of the CIA and LSD is very interesting. Some of you may know the book Acid Dreams by Martin Lee. Fascinating history of the way the government tried and really failed, I think, to use psychedelics. The government's initial approach to LSD was, this is great. This is a truth serum. We can give this to enemy agents and they'll tell us all we know. Well, a few months of following that path, they decided, no, this is an obscurity drug. We can give this to our agents and they can take it if they're captured and no one can learn anything from it. And, you know, clearly this was not a fruitful path either. And I don't fault the government. I don't really fault the government for this. After all, the government is in the business of being the government. I don't think any institution can inculcate psychedelics into its own program, because psychedelics destroy institutions. All institutions. I mean, it's like trying to move an acid around that corrodes whatever pipes you pour it through. And because the boundary dissolving quality of psychedelics is precisely the quality that government is involved in resisting. Government builds up labels, hands out role models, explains how everything is, and this stuff just then melts that back into a primal chaos. So it's pretty corrosive of any social values that don't arise spontaneously out of biological organization. It's anarchist. It's the acid of anarchy in a way. All right, we're never going to get through this list, but it's gratifying to know it's here if we need it. Here's a question about the time wave, which I'm going to skip because we're not talking about the time wave today, and pity the poor soul who's never heard of it. Know of any herbal sources to raise serotonin as a treatment for depression? No, I'm not. I don't know a lot about herbal medicine and that sort of thing, but raising serotonin level as a treatment for depression seems like a pretty good strategy. I don't know of herbs. Usually inhibition of serotonin is what's going on. And with these psychedelics, they do compete with serotonin for the bond site. That's what it's all about at the atomic level, is in your synaptic cleft. In the synaptic clefts of your neurons, there are what are called receptors. And if you were to fly down and look at these things, they look like complex locks There are hooks, protuberances, little drawers, and fit in places. Well, then the drug molecule is carried into the synaptic cleft by the bloodstream, and it seeks to what's called occupy the bond site, or simply bond, and it's trying to fit in. Well, the normal thing which fits in those bonding sites is serotonin, but some of these hallucinogens are much better fits than natural serotonin. They are what pharmacologists say competitive at the bond site, and so they literally elbow the serotonin out of the way, and then they fit themselves into the receptor. Well, once the receptor and its agonist are in place, then the biodynamic, the bioelectric field of the synapse can be activated. Well, if you swap out serotonin for an exotic molecule like harmine or mescaline or something like that, well, then this shifts the mode of this molecular level electrical environment. And I believe that that is what then registers as a higher cortical experience that we call the trip. It's the experience of hundreds of millions of these introduced molecules displacing the normal serotonin and then broadcasting this signal in a slightly different way than it is normally perceived. So there's a molecular connection. There's a connection down into the molecular level. This will be our last one this morning. Language transcendence. Huxley, Jung, and others often mention liberating and enlightening epiphanies as beyond language and iconic imagery. You yourself mention this. Can you explain further the use of transcendental language? Yeah, and we might talk about that a little this afternoon. I sort of alluded to it this morning. My idea is that language is a process that is half completed in us as we sit here, and that language is really something which wants to be seen, not heard, but that we are on our way to evolving toward this visible language. And we currently are operating with these somewhat substandard acoustical codes. And I think in a way history is the process of getting out, revealing, defining, refining this natural language. The place where the psychedelics impact upon us as social creatures is the language domain. I mean, you may have tremendous hierophanies and breakthroughs, but if you can't talk about it, or paint about it, or dance about it, or in any way communicate it to anybody, then it is not efficacious for the species. It's just your private entertainment. So the domain of language is where the collective impact is coming. And one of the things I think about psychedelics is that they are probably capable of helping us force the evolution of language, because we cannot move into the future any faster than our language of description for the future. So if we're interested in streamlining culture and getting away from this sort of random walk style of cultural evolution, then we have to look at rationally interfacing with the evolution of language. And maybe we can talk about that when we come back. Thanks very much.